The small town of Willow Creek, nestled in the heart of Maine, was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. With its cobblestone streets, clapboard houses, and a community church with a steeple that could be seen from nearly every corner of the town, it embodied the quintessential charm of small-town America. Life here was predictable but peaceful, and for Emily Grace Thompson, it was the perfect place to grow up. At just 6 years old, Emily was a spirited little girl with golden hair that curled at the ends and eyes the color of the summer sky. Her giggle was infectious, often echoing through the neighborhood as she played in her family's sprawling backyard. Emily's world was a simple one, filled with tree swings, lemonade stands, and afternoons spent picking dandelions. Her favorite pastime was lying on her back in the grass, watching clouds drift by while inventing stories about their shapes. Emily lived with her parents in a cozy white house with blue shutters and a wraparound porch. Her mother, Sarah, was a middle school teacher who loved nothing more than spending her evenings grading papers with a cup of chamomile tea in hand. Sarah was a gentle soul, the kind of woman who baked cookies for new neighbors and left fresh flowers on the graves of those who had passed on. Her father, Daniel, was a fisherman who spent weeks at a time on the Atlantic Ocean. His tanned skin and calloused hands told the story of a life spent battling waves and pulling up nets, yet his eyes softened every time he looked at Emily. He called her his sunshine because she lit up his world no matter how stormy the seas might be. It was a crisp September morning when Daniel kissed Emily on the forehead before heading out on his next voyage. "Be good for your mom, sunshine," he said, his voice warm but tinged with the sadness that always accompanied his goodbyes. "I will, Daddy," Emily replied, clutching her stuffed bunny tightly. "Promise you'll come back soon?" "As soon as I can," he assured her, ruffling her hair. "And when I do, I'll have something special just for you." Life went on as usual while Daniel was away. Emily spent her days at school, where she loved drawing pictures of her family and telling her classmates about her dad's adventures at sea. She'd make up grand tales about him battling giant squids or discovering hidden treasures, always with a proud grin on her face. At home, Sarah kept busy managing the household. She'd often glance at the calendar on the kitchen wall, counting down the days until Daniel's return. Emily, too, eagerly awaited her father's homecoming, not just for the stories he'd tell, but for the way he'd scoop her up in his strong arms, spinning her around until they were both dizzy with laughter. The town itself played a significant role in Emily's life. There was the old general store where she and her mom would buy groceries and where Mrs. Hargrove, the owner, always slipped her a piece of candy. There was the park with its creaky swings and the ice cream parlor that served the best strawberry sundaes. But Emily's favorite place was her own backyard. The Thompsons' yard was a child's paradise, with its towering oak tree, tire swing, and a wooden playhouse her father had built when she was just 3. Every corner of the yard held a memory. The spot where she planted her first flower, the patch of grass where she tripped and scraped her knee but had been consoled with ice cream, the hammock where her mom would read stories to her under the stars. Despite the simplicity of her days, Emily felt her father's absence keenly. At night, as she lay in bed, she'd stare at the photo of him on her nightstand, wondering what he was doing and if he missed her as much as she missed him. "Come back soon, Daddy," she'd whisper into the darkness, clutching her bunny close. Little did Emily know, her father's next return would mark the beginning of a story that would change their lives forever. It was early October when the sound of heavy boots on the wooden porch announced Daniel's return. Emily had been sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, carefully coloring in a picture of a sailboat. Her head snapped up at the familiar creak of the front door, and her crayons clattered to the floor as she sprang to her feet. "Daddy!" she shrieked, her voice a blend of joy and relief. She ran as fast as her little legs would carry her and leaped into his arms. "Whoa there, sunshine!" Daniel laughed, his deep voice full of warmth. He wrapped her in a bear hug, lifting her off the ground. The faint smell of salt water lingered on his clothes, and his beard tickled her cheek. "Did you miss me?" "Every single day," Emily replied, burying her face in his shoulder. "Did you bring me something?" Daniel chuckled and set her down. "Of course I did. But first, where's your mom?" Sarah appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her face lit up when she saw her husband. "Welcome home," she said, her voice soft but brimming with emotion. She crossed the room to embrace him, holding on just a moment longer than usual. "Good to be back," Daniel murmured. "Missed you both." He pulled back and glanced down at Emily, who was bouncing on the balls of her feet, her impatience impossible to contain. All right, he said with a grin. "I guess I shouldn't keep you waiting any longer." He reached into the large duffel bag slung over his shoulder and pulled out a small, wiggling bundle of fur. Emily gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "A puppy," she whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Not just any puppy," Daniel said, kneeling to place the little golden-furred creature in her arms. "This is Charlie. He's a golden retriever, and he's yours to take care of." The puppy squirmed in Emily's arms, licking her face with enthusiasm. She laughed, her giggles filling the room. "He's perfect. Thank you, Daddy." Sarah crouched next to them, gently petting Charlie's soft fur. "He's adorable," she said, smiling at Daniel. "But a dog's a big responsibility, Emily. You'll have to feed him, walk him, and make sure he's taken care of." "I will, I promise," Emily said earnestly. She held the puppy close, her heart already swelling with love for him. "He's my best friend now." That night, after dinner, Emily sat on the floor with Charlie, introducing him to all her toys. "This is Bunny," she said, holding up her beloved stuffed rabbit. "And this is Dolly. You can't chew on them, though. They're just to look at, okay?" Daniel watched from the couch, a tired but contented smile on his face. "Looks like she's got it all figured out," he said to Sarah, who was folding laundry nearby. "She does now," Sarah replied with a laugh. "But let's see how she feels when it's her turn to clean up after him." Over the next few weeks, Emily and Charlie became inseparable. She took her new responsibilities seriously, waking up early to fill his bowl with kibble and water before heading off to school. In the afternoons, she'd race home to play with him in the backyard, their laughter and barking echoing through the neighborhood. She taught him to sit, stay, and fetch, though he had a habit of bringing back sticks instead of the ball she threw. The backyard, once a quiet haven, was now a playground for the two of them. Leaves crunched under their feet as they chased each other around the oak tree. Charlie would flop down in the grass, panting, while Emily lay beside him, her hand resting on his golden fur. One evening, as the family sat on the porch watching the sunset, Emily turned to her father. "Daddy, why did you pick Charlie?" she asked. Daniel smiled, his eyes thoughtful. "When I saw him, I just knew he was special. And I thought, if anyone deserves a friend like that, it's my sunshine." Emily beamed, wrapping her arms around Charlie. "He's the best gift ever," she said, her voice full of gratitude. As the stars appeared in the night sky, Daniel's words lingered in the air. Little did they know, Charlie's loyalty and love would soon prove to be more than just a gift. It would become a lifeline. Over the next several months, Emily and Charlie became the heart of Willow Creek's little community. Wherever Emily went, Charlie followed. The once quiet streets now echoed with the sound of her laughter and Charlie's happy barks. They were an inseparable pair, drawing smiles from neighbors as they played on the town green or trotted into the general store where Mrs. Hargrove always had a biscuit waiting for Charlie. Emily took her role as Charlie's caretaker seriously. Every morning, she'd scoop kibble into his bowl and refill his water. "Here you go, Charlie. Breakfast time," she'd announce cheerfully, watching as he wagged his tail and devoured his meal. After school, she'd run straight to the backyard, where Charlie was always waiting at the gate, tail wagging furiously. "Missed you, buddy," she'd say, dropping her backpack and throwing her arms around his neck. Then, they'd spend hours exploring every corner of the yard. Emily loved hiding treats for Charlie to sniff out or tossing sticks for him to chase. The bond between them grew stronger with every game, every shared moment. One chilly Saturday morning, Emily decided to teach Charlie a new trick. "Mom, can I borrow some peanut butter?" she asked, peeking into the kitchen. Sarah looked up from her recipe book. "What for?" "I'm teaching Charlie to shake hands," Emily said with a grin. Sarah handed over the jar, laughing. "Good luck. Just make sure he doesn't eat the whole thing." Back in the yard, Emily held out a peanut butter-covered treat. "Okay, Charlie, sit," she commanded. He sat immediately, his golden fur gleaming in the autumn sun. "Now, give me your paw." Charlie tilted his head, confused. Emily giggled. "Come on, like this." She gently lifted his paw into her hand and gave him the treat. "Good boy." By the end of the afternoon, Charlie was proudly offering his paw whenever Emily said, "Shake." She ran into the house to show her parents. "Mom, Dad, look what Charlie can do." Daniel, who had been reading by the fireplace, laughed and clapped. "That's impressive, Sunshine. You're quite the trainer. Charlie's a genius," Emily declared, rubbing his ears. But their bond wasn't just about tricks and games. Charlie seemed to have an instinct for Emily's moods. On days when she felt lonely because her dad was away at sea, Charlie would rest his head on her lap, his big brown eyes filled with quiet understanding. At night, when thunder rumbled through the sky, Emily would bury her face in his fur, finding comfort in his steady presence. One day, while Emily was drawing pictures of her adventures with Charlie, Sarah walked into the living room with a camera. "Emily, sit with Charlie. I want to take a picture of you too." Emily threw her arms around Charlie's neck and grinned at the camera. "Say cheese, Charlie," she giggled. The click of the shutter captured a perfect moment of joy, one that Sarah would later frame and place on the mantel. The community also took notice of the special bond between the girl and her dog. At the annual fall festival, Emily entered Charlie in the Best Pet contest. She stood proudly beside him as he performed his tricks for the judges. When Charlie won a blue ribbon, Emily beamed with pride, holding it up for everyone to see. "Charlie's the best dog in the whole world," she declared. Despite all the happiness Charlie brought, there were moments of challenge, too. One evening, Emily was practicing her spelling words at the kitchen table when Charlie started barking incessantly at the back door. "Charlie, quiet," Sarah called from the stove, but Charlie didn't stop. He scratched at the door, barking louder. "Maybe he needs to go out," Emily said, hopping off her chair to open the door. The moment she did, Charlie bolted into the yard, barking furiously at something near the oak tree. "What's gotten into him?" Daniel asked, stepping outside with a flashlight. As they approached, they saw a raccoon scurry up the tree, its eyes glowing in the beam of light. "Good boy, Charlie," Daniel said, patting him on the head. "You're protecting your family." That night, Emily hugged Charlie extra tight. "You're my hero, Charlie," she whispered, stroking his fur as he dozed at the foot of her bed. Their days were filled with little adventures like these, each one deepening the bond between Emily and her furry best friend. But life in Willow Creek, as peaceful as it seemed, had its moments of unpredictability. No one could have anticipated how deeply their love and trust in each other would be tested in the months to come. The brisk chill of late November had settled over Willow Creek, bringing with it the golden hues of fallen leaves and the smoky scent of fireplaces warming homes. For Emily, it was another day filled with the laughter of play and Charlie's cheerful barks as they chased each other around the backyard. The oak tree, their favorite spot, stood tall and sturdy, its bare branches swaying gently in the cool breeze. That afternoon, Sarah had brought out a basket of apples freshly picked from the market. She placed them on the kitchen counter and called out to Emily through the open window. "Sweetheart, come inside for a snack? I've got apples and peanut butter. Can I eat it outside with Charlie?" Emily called back, her face flushed from running. "Fine," Sarah said with a chuckle, wiping her hands on a dishcloth. "But don't forget to share a piece with him." Emily grabbed a bright red apple from the basket and darted back outside, giggling as Charlie jumped up to greet her. "Okay, boy, this is mine," she said, holding the apple up like a trophy. "You get your own treat later." Charlie wagged his tail, playfully nudging her arm as if to protest. She settled down under the oak tree, crunching into the apple as Charlie lay beside her, his head resting on her lap. The crisp bite of the fruit mingled with the earthy smell of the fallen leaves. It was a moment of pure contentment, the kind of simplicity that felt eternal in the eyes of a child. But then, without warning, everything changed. Emily took another bite, and as she laughed at something Charlie did, she inhaled sharply. A piece of the apple lodged in her throat. Her laughter turned into a choked gasp as she instinctively brought her hands to her neck. Panic set in as she struggled to breathe, her wide blue eyes filling with tears. Charlie immediately sensed that something was wrong. He stood up, whining and pawing at her arm, but Emily couldn't respond. She stumbled to her feet, trying to call out, but no sound came. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the grass. Inside the house, Sarah was drying dishes when Charlie's frantic barking caught her attention. It wasn't his usual playful bark. This was urgent, almost desperate. "What on earth?" she muttered, setting the dish down and heading for the back door. As soon as she stepped outside, she saw Charlie circling Emily, barking and nudging her still body. "Emily?" Sarah's voice was sharp with alarm. She sprinted across the yard, dropping to her knees beside her daughter. "Emily, can you hear me?" Sarah's hands trembled as she turned Emily onto her side. Her face was pale, her lips slightly blue. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her heart pounding. "Daniel, Daniel, get out here." Hearing the panic in her voice, Daniel rushed out from the garage, his eyes widening at the sight. "What happened?" "She's choking," Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face. "I think it's an apple. She can't breathe." Daniel didn't hesitate. He knelt down, trying to perform the Heimlich maneuver, but Emily's small frame made it difficult. "Come on, sunshine," he said through gritted teeth, his voice breaking. "Stay with me." When she didn't respond, Sarah screamed, "We need to get her to the hospital. Now." Daniel scooped Emily into his arms, running toward the car with Sarah close behind. Charlie followed, barking frantically, refusing to leave her side. "Stay, Charlie," Daniel commanded as he placed Emily gently in the back seat. But the dog refused, hopping into the car and sitting next to her, his eyes fixed on her lifeless form. The drive to the hospital was a blur of tears and prayers. Sarah kept reaching back, stroking Emily's hair and whispering, "Hold on, baby. Please, hold on." Charlie, sensing the gravity of the moment, sat still, his usual energy replaced by a quiet vigilance. His gaze never wavered from Emily, as if his presence alone could bring her back. When they arrived at Willow Creek General Hospital, the staff sprang into action. A nurse guided them to the emergency room as a doctor rushed to examine Emily. "She's not breathing," he said grimly. "We need to intubate." Sarah clung to Daniel in the waiting room, her sobs muffled against his chest. Charlie sat at their feet, his ears drooping, his body tense. The minutes dragged on like hours, every second thick with uncertainty. Finally, the doctor emerged, his face somber. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he began, his voice heavy. "We did everything we could, but," he hesitated, glancing down. "I'm sorry. We couldn't find the obstruction in time." Sarah let out a guttural cry, collapsing into Daniel's arms. The weight of the words crushed them both, leaving a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the room. Charlie whimpered softly, nudging Sarah's leg with his nose, as if to offer comfort in the only way he knew how. Emily's small, lifeless body was wheeled out moments later, covered in a white sheet. As her parents followed in a daze, Charlie stayed by the gurney, refusing to leave her side. His loyalty, even in death, was unwavering. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. The quiet hum of the hospital corridor was broken only by the soft shuffle of shoes and the occasional beep of machines. Daniel and Sarah sat in a sterile, dimly lit waiting room, their hands entwined in a desperate grip. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows on their tear-streaked faces. Nearby, Charlie lay curled at their feet, his head resting on his paws. He hadn't moved since Emily was wheeled away. The doctor who had delivered the crushing news earlier returned, accompanied by a nurse. His face remained somber, though his tone was professional. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he began, gesturing for them to sit down. "We need to discuss what happened." Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke, her anguish laced with disbelief. She was fine this morning. She was laughing, playing with Charlie. How could this happen? Her voice cracked, and Daniel tightened his grip on her hand. "We understand how devastating this is," the doctor replied carefully, sitting across from them. When Emily arrived, she wasn't breathing, and her pulse was faint. We followed standard protocol to intubate and restore her airway. Then why couldn't you save her? Daniel's voice rose, his grief quickly transforming into anger. She was only choking. She just needed help. The doctor hesitated, his eyes flicking down to the clipboard in his hands. In cases of severe airway obstruction, identifying and removing the blockage is critical. However, he exhaled slowly. We couldn't locate anything blocking her airway during our initial examination. What do you mean you couldn't find it? Sarah demanded, her voice sharp. She was eating an apple. She must have choked on a piece. That was our assumption as well, the doctor explained, his tone now cautious. But after multiple attempts, there was no visible obstruction. We concluded. We believed, he paused, struggling to find the right words. We declared her deceased based on her lack of oxygen and unresponsive state. Believed? Daniel's voice was almost a growl. You're telling me you guessed our daughter was gone? The doctor raised his hands in a gesture of placation. I understand how this sounds, but in situations like this, time is critical. When traditional interventions don't yield results. So you just gave up? Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. You gave up on my little girl? The room fell into a heavy silence. The doctor's face betrayed a flicker of guilt, but his posture remained firm. We did everything in our power, he said quietly. I'm truly sorry. Charlie, as if sensing the rising tension, let out a low whine, nudging Sarah's leg with his nose. She reached down absent-mindedly to stroke his head, her mind racing with grief and anger. A nurse entered the room with a clipboard, her expression neutral but her voice hesitant. We've prepared Emily's body for transfer to the morgue. If you'd like a moment with her before, Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as fresh tears streamed down her cheeks. Daniel stood abruptly, his fists clenched. No, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. I want to see her. I need to see my little girl. The nurse nodded, her voice soft. Follow me. The Thompsons, with Charlie close at their heels, were led to a small, sterile room where Emily lay on a hospital gurney. Her small body was still, her face pale but peaceful. A white sheet covered her to the chest, her hands folded gently over her stomach. It looked as though she was merely sleeping. Sarah collapsed into a chair beside her, clutching Emily's hand as she wept openly. I'm so sorry, baby, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Daniel stood at the foot of the gurney, his jaw tight, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. He reached out a trembling hand, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's forehead. You didn't deserve this, he murmured. You deserved so much more. Charlie, ignoring the quiet protests of the nurse, jumped up onto the gurney. He sniffed Emily's face and began licking her cheek, his tail wagging faintly. Charlie, Daniel said softly, trying to pull him back. It's okay, boy. She's gone. But Charlie didn't stop. He began pawing at Emily's mouth, his movements frantic and determined. Charlie, no, Sarah exclaimed, her voice a mixture of confusion and grief. The nurse moved to intervene, but Daniel held up a hand. Wait, he said, his eyes narrowing as he watched the dog's actions. What is he doing? Charlie let out a sharp bark, then resumed licking and pawing at Emily's face. Suddenly, a faint cough broke the silence. Emily's chest heaved weakly, and her lips parted as a small, jagged piece of apple fell from her mouth onto the sheet. She's breathing, Sarah screamed, her voice a mix of shock and hope. Oh my God, she's breathing. The room erupted into chaos as nurses and doctors rushed in, their disbelief quickly replaced by action. Daniel scooped Charlie into his arms, holding him close as tears streamed down his face. You saved her, boy, he whispered, his voice choked. You saved our sunshine. The quiet hills of Willow Creek Cemetery were blanketed by the gray light of an overcast morning. The cold wind rustled the bare trees as friends and family gathered around a small casket adorned with white lilies. Daniel and Sarah stood together, their hands clasped so tightly that their knuckles were white. Grief hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Emily's schoolteacher, Mrs. Larson, stood in the crowd, her eyes rimmed red with tears. Nearby, Mrs. Hargrove from the general store held a tissue to her nose, silently sobbing. "Such a tragedy," she whispered to her husband. "She was such a bright little girl." Sarah trembled as the minister began to speak. His voice was low and steady, meant to comfort, but every word felt like a dagger to her heart. "We gather today to mourn the loss of Emily Grace Thompson, a child full of light and love," he began. "Though her time with us was far too short, she touched every life she encountered." Daniel's jaw was tight, his body rigid as he stared at the small casket. He hadn't spoken much since the hospital, too consumed by his grief and anger to form coherent sentences. Beside them, Charlie sat quietly, his golden fur dull under the cloudy sky. His usual energy was gone, replaced by a stillness that mirrored the somber mood of the gathering. As the minister continued, Sarah's mind wandered. She thought of Emily's laughter echoing through the house, the way her little hands would tug at her apron while she cooked, the bedtime stories they'd read together. The memories were so vivid, so alive, that it felt impossible to believe her daughter was gone. When the minister invited Daniel to say a few words, he hesitated. Sarah gave his hand a squeeze, silently urging him forward. He stepped up to the small podium, his throat tight and his hands trembling. "Emily," he began, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Emily was our sunshine. She lit up our lives in ways I can't even begin to describe. She was curious, kind, and so full of life." He paused, his eyes brimming with tears. "I don't understand why this happened. I don't think I ever will. But I do know that she'll always be with us, in every memory, every laugh, every ray of sunshine." As he stepped down, Sarah collapsed into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The minister nodded solemnly and gestured for the pallbearers to lower the casket. "May she rest in eternal peace," he said, his voice echoing across the cemetery. But then, just as the first handful of dirt was thrown onto the casket, something unusual happened. Charlie, who had been sitting quietly by Sarah's side, suddenly bolted forward. His ears perked up and his body language changed. He leapt onto the edge of the open casket, drawing gasps from the mourners. "Charlie!" Sarah cried, rushing forward to pull him back. But he wouldn't budge. He barked once, sharply, and then began pawing at the casket. His movements were frantic, his nails scratching against the polished wood. The sound was jarring against the silence of the crowd. "What's he doing?" Mrs. Larson whispered, her brow furrowed. Daniel stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Charlie, come on, boy. Get down." He reached for the dog, but Charlie barked again and began pawing at the edge of the casket as though he was trying to dig something out. Then, to everyone's shock, a faint sound broke through the air, a cough. It was weak, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the crowd as all eyes turned to the small casket. Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He dropped to his knees beside the casket, his hands shaking as he leaned closer. "Emily." Another faint cough emerged, followed by a shallow, rattling breath. "She's alive," Daniel shouted, his voice a mix of disbelief and urgency. "Get her out of there." Chaos erupted as the pallbearers scrambled to open the casket. Inside, Emily lay pale and still, but her chest rose and fell ever so slightly. Her lips were tinged with color, and her eyes fluttered weakly. "She's breathing," Sarah screamed, clutching her daughter's hand. "Oh my God, she's breathing." Someone in the crowd called for an ambulance, but the focus remained on Emily. Charlie jumped into the casket, licking her face and whining softly. It was as if he knew all along that she wasn't gone. As the paramedics arrived and carefully lifted Emily out of the casket, the crowd stood in stunned silence. Tears of grief turned to tears of joy and disbelief as Emily's faint voice whispered, "Mommy, Daddy." The Thompsons held her tightly, their relief pouring out in sobs. Charlie stood by their side, wagging his tail for the first time in days. He had saved her, their loyal golden retriever, the true hero of the day. The funeral turned into a celebration of life, a miracle that no one in Willow Creek would ever forget. The ambulance sirens had long faded into the distance by the time the mourners dispersed, leaving the Thompsons alone in their home with Emily and Charlie. The day's events felt surreal, as if they had been pulled from the plot of a movie. Emily was alive, weak but alive, and it was all thanks to Charlie's extraordinary actions. In the days following the incident, the household was a flurry of activity. Nurses and doctors visited regularly to ensure Emily's recovery, while neighbors stopped by with meals, gifts, and prayers. Despite the outpouring of support, Daniel and Sarah couldn't stop replaying the scene in their minds. How had Charlie known? What drove him to act so decisively? Emily, now recovering in her bed, was oblivious to the gravity of what had happened. She was still groggy, her voice soft and her movements slow, but she managed a faint smile every time Charlie jumped onto her bed, curling up beside her protectively. "You're my hero, Charlie," she whispered one evening, running her small fingers through his fur. "You saved me." Charlie wagged his tail lightly, his eyes never leaving hers. He seemed to understand the importance of his role, sticking close to Emily's side as if guarding her from any further harm. Daniel often found him outside her bedroom door, lying on the floor with his head resting on his paws. One afternoon, as Emily napped, Daniel and Sarah sat at the kitchen table, still grappling with everything that had happened. Sarah cradled a cup of coffee in her hands, her eyes distant. "I can't stop thinking about it," she said softly. "If it weren't for Charlie." Daniel nodded, his expression serious. He didn't just bark or whine. He knew. He was trying to tell us something, even at the hospital. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. How could he have known? "He's just a dog." "Not just a dog," Daniel corrected. "He's part of this family, and I don't think we'll ever fully understand how he did it. But I'll be damned if I'm not grateful every single day." That evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Emily sat in her favorite armchair, wrapped in a soft blanket. Charlie lay at her feet, his ears perked and his tail gently thumping against the floor. Sarah brought over a tray of tea and cookies, setting it on the coffee table. "Emily," Sarah said gently, sitting beside her daughter, "do you remember anything from that day? Anything at all?" Emily furrowed her brow, her small face scrunching up in concentration. "I remember eating the apple," she said slowly, "and playing with Charlie. Then, I don't know." Her voice trailed off, and she looked down at her hands. "I just remember being really scared." Daniel leaned forward. "And Charlie? Do you remember what he did?" Emily's eyes lit up, and she reached down to stroke his head. "He was barking, and I think he was trying to help me. I remember him licking me. He made me feel like I wasn't alone." Sarah wiped a tear from her eye and hugged her daughter tightly. "You were never alone, sweetheart. Charlie was there, and we were too." The days turned into weeks, and Emily continued to recover, her energy slowly returning. Charlie's protective instincts, however, didn't waver. He followed her everywhere, even to the bathroom, much to her amusement. "Charlie, you're being silly," she'd giggle, trying to close the door while he stood patiently outside. One evening, Sarah noticed something unusual. Charlie had been sitting by the back door, staring at it intently. His tail wagged occasionally, but his body was tense, as though he was waiting for something. "What is it, boy?" Sarah asked, walking over. Charlie let out a low whine and pawed at the door. "Is everything okay?" Daniel asked, coming in from the garage. "I'm not sure," Sarah replied, opening the door slightly. Charlie bolted outside, barking loudly as he ran toward the oak tree. "Not again," Daniel muttered, grabbing a flashlight and following him. When they reached the tree, they found Charlie barking at its base, pawing at the dirt. "What is it, boy?" Daniel asked, shining the light around. He bent down and noticed a cluster of small, jagged rocks. Lying among them was a glimmer of something metallic. Daniel reached down, brushing away the dirt, and pulled out an old, rusted tin box. He opened it, revealing a faded photograph and a handful of trinkets, an old locket, a small figurine, and a note written in spidery handwriting. "What on earth?" Daniel murmured, examining the items. He turned to Charlie, who sat beside him, wagging his tail proudly. Back inside, the family gathered around the box, puzzled by its contents. The note revealed that it belonged to the previous owners of the house, a family who had lived there decades earlier. The trinkets were keepsakes from their children, left behind when they had moved. "I don't know how you find these things, Charlie," Sarah said, shaking her head in amazement. "But you've got quite the nose for mysteries." Emily beamed, hugging Charlie tightly. "You're the smartest dog ever," she declared. "My hero." Though the discovery of the box was a small, curious moment, it deepened the family's sense that Charlie was no ordinary dog. His instincts, loyalty, and unwavering love had not only saved Emily but continued to bring them together in ways they could never have imagined. Winter had fully arrived in Willow Creek, blanketing the small town in snow and bringing the kind of crisp, quiet mornings that seemed frozen in time. Inside the Thompson home, warmth radiated from the fireplace, filling the living room with a cozy glow. Emily, still recovering but regaining her strength, was seated on the couch with a blanket draped over her legs. Charlie was by her side, as always, his head resting on her lap. The events of the past weeks had left the family shaken but grateful. Emily's survival was nothing short of miraculous, and while the details still puzzled them, they chose to focus on their second chance. The community, too, shared in their joy, frequently stopping by with meals, well wishes, and gifts for Charlie, the celebrated hero of the town. But as Emily grew stronger, something continued to gnaw at Daniel and Sarah. The piece of apple that had caused the choking should have been caught at the hospital. The doctor's failure to find it haunted them, leaving lingering questions about what truly happened that day. One crisp morning, as the family sat down for breakfast, Emily looked up from her plate and said, "Mommy, I don't think I liked being in the box." Sarah froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "The box?" she repeated, her voice cautious. Emily nodded, her expression serious. "The wooden box. It was so small. I wanted to get out, but I couldn't." Daniel and Sarah exchanged a look. They hadn't spoken to Emily about the funeral. They had avoided the subject, believing she wouldn't remember, or wouldn't need to. Yet her words were unmistakable. "What do you remember about it, sweetheart?" Daniel asked gently, leaning closer. Emily frowned, her small hands playing with the edge of the tablecloth. "It was dark," she said softly. "But then I heard Charlie. He was barking so loud. And then he licked my face. After that, I felt better." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she reached for Emily's hand. "You're so brave, my love," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You've been through so much." "Charlie made it okay," Emily added, looking down at her furry companion. "He's the best dog in the whole world." Daniel cleared his throat, his emotions thick in his chest. "He is, isn't he?" he said, scratching Charlie behind the ears. "We're lucky to have him." Later that day, as Emily rested upstairs, Daniel decided it was time to revisit the hospital. He'd been putting it off, unsure if it was worth reopening the wounds. But now he needed answers. He placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "I'm going to Willow Creek, General," he said. "I want to talk to them about what happened." Sarah hesitated, but then nodded. "You deserve answers. We all do." At the hospital, Daniel was greeted with polite but wary expressions. He explained his concerns to the head physician, a serious-looking man with silver-rimmed glasses. "I'm not here to accuse anyone," Daniel said firmly. "But my daughter almost died because of what I believe was a mistake. I need to understand how that happened." The physician sighed, gesturing for Daniel to follow him into his office. "Mr. Thompson, I reviewed Emily's case after the incident. What happened was extremely rare, but it wasn't handled as well as it should have been." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Go on." "When Emily was brought in, her vital signs were weak, and we couldn't detect the obstruction in her airway," the doctor explained. "It's possible that it shifted deeper, making it difficult to locate. But declaring her deceased, that was premature. I've already spoken to the attending physician, and he's undergoing a review." Daniel felt a surge of anger, but he kept his voice steady. "So you're saying she was alive the entire time?" "Yes," the doctor admitted, his tone regretful. "If your dog hadn't acted the way he did, well, it's likely we wouldn't have discovered the obstruction in time." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He stared at the doctor, his hands clenching into fists. "Do you realize how close we came to burying her alive?" he said, his voice shaking. "If it wasn't for Charlie, we'd have lost her." The doctor nodded solemnly. "Your dog's actions were extraordinary. It's clear he has a strong bond with your daughter. I don't have an explanation for how he knew, but he saved her life." When Daniel returned home, his emotions were a storm of anger, relief, and gratitude. He shared everything with Sarah, who listened quietly, her face pale. "They almost let her die," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "How could they make such a mistake?" "They admitted it," Daniel replied, his fists clenched. "But what matters is that she's here. She's alive because of Charlie." That evening, as the family sat together by the fire, Daniel looked at Charlie, who lay contentedly at Emily's feet. "You're more than a dog," he said quietly. "You're our guardian angel." Charlie lifted his head, his big brown eyes meeting Daniel's, and for a moment, it felt as though he understood every word. The experience left the Thompsons more united than ever, their love for Charlie growing deeper with every passing day. But the memory of how close they had come to losing Emily remained, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the extraordinary bond that had saved it. The days turned into weeks, and Emily's energy slowly returned. By mid-December, her laughter was once again filling the Thompson house, though the scars of the ordeal lingered in subtle ways. She tired more easily, and there was a new caution in the way Daniel and Sarah watched over her, as though afraid she might slip away if they let their guard down. Charlie, however, remained as steadfast as ever. From the moment Emily woke each morning, he was by her side. He'd wag his tail excitedly as she shuffled down the stairs in her pajamas, his soft barks urging her to play. And though Emily wasn't yet ready for their old games of fetch or tag in the backyard, Charlie seemed content just being near her. One morning, Emily sat at the kitchen table with a glass of orange juice and a plate of toast in front of her. She took small bites, her eyes occasionally drifting to Charlie, who sat at her feet. "Mommy, do you think Charlie knows he saved me?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. Sarah turned from the sink, drying her hands on a dish towel. "I think he knows exactly how special he is," she said with a smile, leaning down to pat Charlie's head. "Don't you, boy?" Charlie wagged his tail, looking between Sarah and Emily as if he understood every word. Emily giggled, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "You're the best dog in the whole world." Later that day, Emily's physical therapist, Mrs. Burke, arrived for her weekly session. A kind woman in her early 50s, Mrs. Burke had been working with Emily to rebuild her strength. "You're looking stronger every time I see you," she said warmly, setting down her bag of equipment. "How are you feeling today?" "Good," Emily replied, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. She looked at the small balance beam and set of resistance bands Mrs. Burke had brought with her, her brows furrowing slightly. Charlie, sensing her hesitation, nudged her hand with his nose. "It's okay," Emily said softly, stroking his fur. "I can do it." The session began slowly, with Mrs. Burke guiding Emily through a series of stretches. When it was time for the balance beam, Emily hesitated. "What if I fall?" she asked, looking up at her mother. "You won't," Sarah assured her, crouching beside her. "And even if you do, we'll be right here to catch you." Charlie stood at the end of the beam, wagging his tail as if to encourage her. Emily took a deep breath and placed one foot on the beam, then the other. Slowly, carefully, she began to walk, her arms outstretched for balance. "You're doing great," Mrs. Burke said, clapping her hands. "Keep going." When Emily reached the end, she beamed with pride. Charlie barked, jumping up and spinning in circles as if to celebrate her success. "See? I told you he knows," Emily said with a laugh, hugging him tightly. As the weeks passed, Emily continued to grow stronger, her confidence returning with each small victory. By Christmas, she was running through the house with Charlie, her laughter echoing off the walls. On Christmas morning, the family gathered around the tree, exchanging gifts. Daniel handed Emily a small box wrapped in shiny red paper. "This one's special," he said, his voice warm. Emily tore off the paper to reveal a silver locket. She opened it to find a tiny picture of herself on one side and Charlie on the other. "It's perfect," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. She threw her arms around her father's neck. "Thank you, Daddy." Daniel held her close, his throat tight. "I want you to remember, sunshine, how strong you are and how much we all love you." Emily smiled, slipping the locket around her neck. She knelt down beside Charlie, holding the locket so he could see it. "Look, Charlie, you're always with me now." Charlie licked her face, making her giggle. Sarah watched the scene from the couch, her heart full as she wiped a tear from her cheek. It was a Christmas none of them would ever forget, a celebration of love, resilience, and the bond that had carried them through the darkest of times. That night, as Emily drifted off to sleep, Charlie lay beside her bed, his head resting on his paws. The silver locket glinted in the soft glow of the nightlight, a silent testament to the journey they had shared and the miracle of second chances. By the time the snow began to melt in Willow Creek, life in the Thompson household had regained a sense of normalcy, or at least as much as it could after the events of the past few months. Emily was now fully recovered, her cheeks flushed with health and her laughter once again echoing through the house. Charlie remained her constant companion, his golden fur a comforting presence that never strayed far from her side. The story of Emily's survival had become a legend in the small town. Everyone knew about Charlie's heroic instincts, and people often stopped Daniel or Sarah at the general store to ask about the miracle dog. Mrs. Hargrove had even pinned a photo of Charlie and Emily on the bulletin board by the counter, a small caption underneath reading, "Willow Creek's little hero." One sunny afternoon, Emily sat on the porch with Sarah, brushing Charlie's fur while he lay sprawled out contentedly. "Mommy," Emily said, her voice curious, "why do you think Charlie knew I was in trouble?" Sarah set down her cup of tea, considering the question. "Well," she began, choosing her words carefully, "I think Charlie loves you so much that he just felt it. Dogs are like that, you know? They can sense things about the people they love." "Like magic?" Emily asked, her eyes wide with wonder. Sarah smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's face. "Not magic, exactly. It's more like instinct. It's something deep inside them, something they can't explain, but that tells them when the people they care about need them." Emily looked down at Charlie, who was now watching her with his warm, intelligent eyes. "Then I think Charlie has the best instincts in the whole world," she said firmly. "Because he saved me." Later that week, a local reporter visited the Thompson home to write a piece about Charlie's story for the town newspaper. The reporter, a young woman named Julia, sat on the living room couch with a notepad and pen, her face animated with interest. "So, tell me about that day," Julia said, leaning forward. "When did you realize that Charlie wasn't just barking? He was trying to tell you something?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed as he thought. "It's hard to put into words," he admitted. "At first, we thought he was just upset, like any dog would be. But the way he acted, it was different. He didn't stop, didn't give up. He knew something wasn't right." And then at the funeral, Sarah's voice trailed off, her eyes glistening. "When he jumped onto the casket, I thought he was just grieving. But now I know, he wasn't mourning. He was saving her." Julia nodded, scribbling furiously in her notebook. "It's incredible," she said. "You know, there's research that suggests dogs can sense things like changes in a person's breathing or heartbeat. But what Charlie did goes beyond that." Emily, who had been sitting quietly with Charlie on the floor, piped up. "He's not just a dog," she said matter-of-factly. "He's my best friend, and best friends always take care of each other." Julia smiled warmly, her gaze softening. "That's a beautiful way to put it, Emily." The article, titled "The Hero of Willow Creek: How One Dog Saved a Life," was published the following week, and it quickly became the talk of the town. People stopped by the house to bring Charlie treats and to tell the Thompsons how moved they were by the story. Emily, though a little shy about all the attention, loved hearing people praise her beloved dog. But for the Thompsons, the real lesson of the experience was deeply personal. One evening, as they sat together in the backyard under the glow of the patio lights, Daniel spoke up. "I've been thinking about what happened," he said, his voice low. "And about Charlie." Sarah looked at him, curious. What about him? He reminded me of something, Daniel continued, glancing at Emily, who was lying on the grass with Charlie beside her. He reminded me that love isn't just about words or actions. It's about being there, really being there. When it matters most, Sarah reached for his hand, her eyes glistening with emotion. He taught all of us that. Emily looked up from where she was playing with Charlie, her locket catching the light. What are you talking about? She asked. Daniel smiled. About how lucky we are to have Charlie and each other. Emily grinned, hugging Charlie tightly. I already knew that, she said, her voice full of certainty. The family sat together in comfortable silence, the sounds of the evening wrapping around them like a warm blanket. For the Thompsons, life had been forever changed by one extraordinary moment, but it had also been enriched by the love and loyalty of a dog who refused to give up on the people he cared about. Charlie wasn't just a pet. He was a protector, a best friend, and a symbol of the bond that holds families together. And in the quiet glow of that evening, with Emily safe and happy, the Thompsons knew they would carry his lesson with them always. Love, guided by instinct, has the power to overcome anything. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's incredibly moving.